So other important places, Istanbul, and, well, this is, I think I've got two, Istanbul, and Jerusalem. This is the Jaffa Gate, I believe, to Jerusalem. And so what we call these two places, which are also very special central places in our church, we've given the bishops there special names. We call them patriarchs. And we call the places patriarchates. So again, not quite as special as Echmiadzin, but we recognize that these are important places and centers of the church. So how, in part, did they come, how did they become these sort of really special places? So Bolis, we call it Bolis, which is just a sort of shortening, and it means the city. And, maybe the Bolsetsis will agree, it's the city. It's like New Yorkers, if you're near New York, if you're like in Jersey and you're like, I'm going to the city, everybody knows what you're talking about, And New Yorkers are like, there's really only one city, New York. Bolsetsis are a little the same, and I'm an adopted Bolsetsi, so to me it's the city. So they call it Bolis, the city. And because it was the seat of power of the Ottoman Empire, right, this is the head of the empire, where at the time most living Armenians were living in the Ottoman Empire, this became a really important place, right? You're near the Sultan, near the sort of imperial center, and you've got Armenians scattered throughout the empire. So what happened, and actually it was a sort of administrative move, the Sultan who conquered Istanbul brought a bishop from Bursa, actually, from near, well, kind of near Istanbul, and he brought this bishop, I thought I had his name, brought this bishop from Bursa, and put him in Istanbul, and said, you are now the head of all the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. You are the Patriarch of Istanbul. So actually, the position in Istanbul is exactly because Istanbul was the seat, the center of imperial power. This is why it became important. So since, and this was in 1453, so since then, there have been patriarchs in Istanbul. So there, let's see, what else do I want to talk about here? What do I need to say on these things or not? So when he brought the bishop from Bursa and made him the patriarch, this was the beginning of what they called it the millet system. So maybe some of you might have heard this term, millet. And basically it was a grouping of religious minorities, really for tax purposes. I like to, when I think about millet, what I think about, I call it a corporate ecclesial tax group, which basically just means they use the church hierarchy to collect taxes for them. So there was a way for all the Muslims in the empire to pay taxes. But what the Sultan did, he said, okay, Patriarch of Istanbul, you're in charge of collecting all the taxes from the Armenians. And that group was called the millet. So there was an Armenian millet, there was a Greek Orthodox millet, and there was also a Jewish millet. This one was sort of really made up because the Jewish religion, the faith doesn't work in the same way as our churches do. So actually Mehmet the Sultan invented the position of Grand Rabbi. He just made it up. And that's how the three millets were sort of formed. The Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews. And this was the situation for most of the Ottoman Empire. They call it the millet system, is what people call it in the scholarship. Is that this is how the minorities were organized in the Ottoman Empire. So actually, I have a good quote here from Malakia Armenian. Does everybody know Armenian?
Yes.
So Armenian was a very, very famous, actually he was an Armenian Catholic, who then converted back to our church and became Patriarch of Istanbul at the end of the 19th century. He wrote a number of very famous books. The one, it's called The Church of Armenia, is translated into English. It's a very good introduction. I've got a list here of books I recommend, and one of them is Armenian's The Church of Armenia. And so Armenian tells us, actually, he gives us a nice little explanation. He says, all matters concerning family life, such as marriage, public instruction, charities, worship and its ministers, spiritual administration, were made over to the jurisdiction of the religious head. In this way, the Patriarch found himself invested with a kind of civil or imperial patriciate. So what he's saying is that the Patriarch of Istanbul was not just the bishop, but because he was sort of collecting taxes for all the Armenians, he became a sort of important kind of political figure in a way. He was the sort of the head of the Armenians, as well as being the bishop and the patriarch of the church community. So he goes on to say that the Armenian patriarchs of Constantinople applied themselves in the course of the same period to centralize as far as possible the affairs of their people in the provinces in the interior. Their administrative sphere of action gradually extended itself over all the provinces of the empire until it comprised the dioceses under the spiritual control of the Patriarchates of Sis, this becomes the Catholicos in Antilios, of Akhtamar, which we saw, and of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem at the time was inside of the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for most of the Ottoman period. But Armenian presence in Jerusalem is much, much, much older than that. So actually, if we were in Evanston right now, somebody's giving a talk about this book about Jerusalem. So we have dueling talks today. So Armenians have had a presence in Jerusalem actually since its real sort of first official time as a Christian place. And this sounds weird because Jerusalem is where Jesus was. It's always been a Christian place. But what happened actually, in 78 AD, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple and sort of completely ruined Jerusalem. And so actually for the first couple hundred years of Christian history, Jerusalem wasn't really an important place. It sounds very strange to say, right? It seems weird that Jerusalem wasn't important to Christians. But for the first 200 or 300 years, because there was like nobody living there, they had destroyed the city, it became less important. So Jerusalem becomes important again. Thank you, that's useful. Jerusalem becomes important again when Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great. So Constantine the Great is the one who makes the Byzantine Empire Christian, and we like to say we beat him by 11 years or whatever. We snuck in before he made the Byzantine Empire Christian. And his mother was a very, very devout Christian, and she went when we celebrate Hashverots. And the discovery of the Holy Cross, when they put the basil in the fall. This commemorates one of the things, you'll hear this story, I'm sure Dan I will remind you come September, the story of the discovery of the Holy Cross. So St. Helena looked for and found the true cross of Jesus, and she became very invested in Jerusalem. And so actually, first off, we have, very quickly, here's me in Jerusalem, just for fun, so you can see the Dome of the Rock back there. But so one of the things that St. Helena did was to start rebuilding in Jerusalem. So it's been sort of abandoned for 300 years. And St. Helena starts to build churches in Jerusalem. And one of the things that she begins to build is the building that actually becomes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So actually it's been added on and all kinds of things. But the site where she started building in the middle of the 4th century is still the same site where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is today. So I have here also, this is the plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So after this, after St. Helena starts building in Jerusalem again, then it becomes important for Christians again. And at that time, Armenians immediately recognize that Jerusalem is important. So as soon as it becomes re-inhabited and rebuilt, Armenians go there immediately. So Dr. Abraham Terian, another one of St. Narcissus' great instructors and one of our great scholars, has recently published a translation and commentary on what is called the Letter of Bishop Macarius. And this is one of these things that shows that Armenians recognized that Jerusalem was important right away. Because what this letter is, it's from about 400 something, and a bishop in Armenia sent a letter to the bishop in Jerusalem, not in Armenian, just the bishop in Jerusalem, asking questions about liturgy. And the bishop writes back to this bishop in Armenia. So already at about 400, Armenians were looking to Jerusalem as an important center. And actually, our own Father Daniel has shown that much of our liturgy derives from things that used to happen in Jerusalem, actually. So the word tapor, maybe, this is one of Father Daniel's favorites. Maybe you've heard the word tapor, which we just use to mean, tapor, the going around, right? So if we start Badarach at the very, very beginning, they go all the way around the church, and tapor, well, tapor sounds a lot like Mount Tabor. And in fact, one of the things that Father Daniel has shown was that in Jerusalem there was a sort of procession that had to do with this place name. And this is how Armenians then thought about it, that this sort of very located liturgical practice we sort of took on. So Jerusalem has been incredibly important for the development of our own liturgical practices. And this is something that Father Daniel can tell you about much better than I can. So, what happens in terms of the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem? The other book that I recommend to you is this book by Michael Papazian. It's called Light from Light. It's a really beautiful, accessible book about sort of Armenian church history. And he tells us that the Caliph Omar, so one of the Arab caliphs, one of the Arab sultans, sort of, in 586, first after succeeding Muhammad, is said to have approved the establishment of the see for an Armenian bishop in Jerusalem. So one of the very first Arab sort of imperial caliphs recognized an Armenian bishop. So the first bishop to occupy the see was Abraham. So in 638, there was a bishop in Jerusalem called Abraham, and we recognize him as the very first patriarch of Jerusalem. So here we have, this is the entry to the Armenian monastery, the Armenian quarter, the part of Jerusalem that is the Armenian Patriarchate here. So this is the entry to the Surpago. And this is quite interesting. Right at the outside of Jerusalem, of the Armenian part of Jerusalem. So Saladin, the famous, actually apparently of Kurdish descent, the famous sort of anti-crusader who captured Jerusalem for the sort of the Muslims, recognized the Armenian presence in Jerusalem. And this is actually supposed to be, let's see, sort of rough Arabic here, is supposed to be the decree from Saladin saying that, you know what, the Armenians, they're here in Jerusalem, don't bother them. So Saladin, in around 1187, recognized the Armenian Patriarchate, in a sense. So the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem also has a very, very long and historical presence. So these are these two sorts of important places that are not Catholicoses, they're not Catholicosates, but they're nonetheless incredibly central and important parts of Armenia, of the sort of Armenian church. And this is sort of the background of them that I've given you so far. Let's see, where would I like to go? So the other thing that I want to say about the two of them, the two things together, then the rest, this is sort of the history that I've given you. What I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about now is why it's interesting to think about them together. Because they're very different places in many ways. But I think that they share a lot of similar problems today, and they share a lot of, in this sort of historical moment that they both are very special places. So one of the things that I would sort of suggest that makes them special together, thank you, is this, it's a sort of a legal term, but it's what I would call jurisdiction. Right? So jurisdiction means where you are in charge. And this plays out in parts of the Middle East, actually. So for instance, we recognize actually that Aram Catholicos is sort of in charge of a lot of parts of Syria, for instance. This is jurisdiction. We just say, you know what, you're in charge of that part of the world, we let you do that. In the Ottoman Empire, this becomes really weird, because Jerusalem is older. There's an older Armenian presence in Jerusalem than there is in Istanbul. But because Istanbul is the imperial center, slowly the Patriarch of Istanbul, in a sense, is sort of the boss of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. And that never went over very well. They did not really like that. The patriarchs in Jerusalem knew that they were older and, in a sense, more important. But there was this sort of tension between these things. So one of the interesting things that happens with jurisdiction, and what makes the patriarchates special, is that both of them have a lot of control and a lot of say over their individual places. So for instance, if Qajaq Serbazan decided he wanted to change some rules, he doesn't really get to do that. There are certain rules he can change, but there are certain ones that he just is not going to be able to do because of the way that he recognizes the Catholicos. But the patriarchates are sort of left to the side. So one of the interesting examples comes from Istanbul. So the current patriarch, Mesro Mutafian, is unfortunately, he's basically in a coma. He's been very sick for several years. And they have, we could call him the vicar general, or we could call him the acting patriarch in some ways. But the actual current patriarch is really ill. But before he got sick, he was a very dynamic and interesting character. And one of the things that he did, is that he created a church service. It was not a sacrament. It was not a full wedding. But he created a church service where you could get married in the church even if you were marrying a Muslim Turk. And he invented this. It's not, in fact, it's actually like if you tried to do that here, that would not fly. You cannot do that. So this is part of what I mean by jurisdiction. Because nobody could tell him not to do that. And they've stopped doing this. Aram Sarpazan, who is the vicar general / acting patriarch, has decided that actually this was not very canonical and has stopped doing these things. And whatever you think about it, whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, and the reason he did it is because just like here in America, we marry Americans that are not Armenian, in Turkey, Armenians marry Turks. The problem, though, is that if we marry a random American, there's a high chance that there's some kind of Christian. So it's perhaps less problematic. But Patriarch Mesro recognized that if you say, well, you married a Turk, forget about you, then you're going to lose a lot of people. People aren't going to come to church, they're not going to be part of the Armenian community. So he recognized that, and he created this service in order to make people feel like they were still welcome. Now again, we can agree or disagree, and canonically it's pretty iffy. It's not true anywhere. But the reason I bring it up is because it points to this idea of jurisdiction. He could do that because as the patriarch of Istanbul, in a sense, everything that happens in Turkey is up to him. Nobody else is really going to sort of argue with that. And this is part of what makes these patriarchates special. So both in Istanbul and in Jerusalem, these kinds of things happen. So this is part of, let's see, where are my picture guys? So here's a nice map of Istanbul. This comes from another really great book that the Quran Dig Foundation put together. All these little red dots, you can't necessarily read the names, but all these little red dots are Armenian churches. Not all apostolic churches. Most of them are. But they are all the Armenian churches spread out around Istanbul. So I'll spend a little bit of time, and then maybe we can just do questions and talk more informally. So my research actually is based in Turkey, and it's with the Armenians, and it's about sort of minority rights and the way that the law works in Turkey today. So these are the things that I know the most about, so we can spend more time talking about that maybe. But, so let me tell you a little bit about the situation in each of these places today and why I think it's still important to think Istanbul and Jerusalem together, and what my sort of perhaps maybe appeal in thinking about them, why I think it's important to talk about the two patriarchates. So, first off, sort of looking at this map, you'll see that, there are Armenian things, churches in this case, all throughout Istanbul, but at this point, a lot of the Armenians live in sort of a couple neighborhoods. There are fewer, for instance, I spent a lot of time going to a church right here. It used to have a nice Armenian population. Now there's about 3 Armenian families in the neighborhood of Kuzgunjuk.
Which one is that?
That's Kuzgunjuk. Kuzgunjuk.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's maybe 3 Armenian families that live there, and they've reopened the church. But because here in Üsküdar it's a very old and big church, for a long time they said, there's 3 families. Just go to the church in Üsküdar. You're fine. But they've reopened this church, actually. So what has happened is that the numbers of Armenians is not what it used to be. There's about anywhere between 40 and 70,000 Armenians, depending on who you ask and what the count is. And this doesn't include what's happened in recent years is undocumented workers from the Republic of Armenia come to work in Istanbul. Usually women working in sort of domestic labor situations. So maybe if you add those up, maybe if you get ambitious, you can say that there's 100,000 Armenians living in Istanbul. That's generous, but let's say 100,000. And the city officially has 14 million people. It's a big city, and that's official. That doesn't count. I would say it's probably closer to 18 million, probably. So 100,000 Armenians in a city of 14 to 18 million people. So let's see, what's my next map? So here, this is a second map that shows now these little, this is a bad picture. These little red dots are Armenian schools and hospitals. So you'll see that some of them were in the same places as the other little red dots that were churches. But again, there are these Armenian institutions, churches, schools, hospitals, spread all throughout the city. And this was one of the things, we've got some Bolsetsis here who are not surprised by this, but lots of Armenians are surprised that you've got, Armenian churches and institutions and things spread out still this far all around Istanbul. And this is, it's a very basic thing, but it's something that I think is important to remind ourselves, because there is still an active Armenian population. Most of it today now is in Istanbul. So Armenians in Turkey, when we talk about Armenians in Turkey, I mostly mean Armenians in Istanbul. There's a couple places outside of the city where there are still Armenians. So, actually even the Malatya population at this point is there's not too many. But even people of, around age 50 or so, there were many who were born in Malatya, although now most of them have moved to Istanbul. There is still an Armenian village. There is one Armenian village left in Turkey called Vakiflik over here, Vakiflik. Yes, in Hatay, yes, in the region of Hatay. So it's actually, if you know the famous, the 40 days of Musa Dagh, it's one of the villages that was part of Musa Dagh. And so this village is still there. And then also in the Hatay region, in Iskenderun, there's also a church there. There is a church that is standing and functional, and it has a sort of legal presence in Kayseri, but there are really no Armenians there. And then Diyarbakir is, I spent some time in Diyarbakir, where they have redone the church, they've renovated the church, and there was actually a number of Armenians who knew that their parents were Armenian, but had been converted to Islam, who started spending time at the church. Unfortunately, in the last 6 months, because of the situation in the country, this is totally up in the air. It makes me very sad, because I really love that church, actually. So we have all of these sort of properties throughout the city of Istanbul, and here actually somebody will recognize this for sure, I know. And this, you might actually also recognize the person. I don't know if you've ever met Deacon Alan Gendian, but he is a force to be reckoned with in the Western Diocese.
Is that Megan's father?
It's Megan's dad, yeah. And so this is the two of us together, and this is outside one of the central churches in Istanbul, that I believe is attached to Gentronagan, right? Yep. So we have all of these.
This is a remake, by the way. This is a remake.
Yes.
It was demolished during road construction in the 50s. And This is a remake.
Oh.
So, but part of why I chose this picture is because it's one of the few Armenian churches where the kumpet, the dome, is visible from the road, actually. A lot of Armenian churches in Istanbul are sort of hidden behind walls, or their kumpets are sort of low, or they don't have them in that kind of way. This is one of the few churches in Istanbul where if you were just visiting and you're walking down the street, you would look and you would say, oh my gosh, that is definitely an Armenian church. So the point of showing some of this is that there is still a surprisingly active Armenian population in Istanbul, and I spent a lot of time with this surprisingly active population. I've got, let's see here, so we also, like I said, here is Diyarbakir. So this is outside, this is sort of the entryway to sort of Giragos. Here is a nice sort of old postcard of the Diyarbakir area of sort of Giragos. Let's see, what else do we have here? Where am I at? This is just text about the Patriarchate. So one of the sort of things that I was amazed and enjoyed while I was in Istanbul was that there is still an active Armenian press. It's not what it used to be, of course, but there are still 2 Armenian language daily newspapers. So they're small, they're 4 pages. You open it up like this, it just folds like this. But there are 2 of them, Jamanag and Marmara, come out every day except for Sunday. And then there is also now the very famous, it's a bilingual, it's mostly in Turkish, but it's got a centerfold that is in Armenian, and it's a weekly newspaper. This was Hrant Dink's newspaper. So we have the institutions of these newspapers that are still part of the active community life in Istanbul. Here is Patriarch Mesrop in his better days, unfortunately. We should all pray for him. Again, so the Patriarchate and all of the churches, there are 36 active or sort of functional Armenian apostolic churches. There are a few Catholic and Protestant churches as well, but 36 functional Armenian apostolic churches in the city of Istanbul. And actually, since I started going there in 2011, there have been 6 priests ordained, just in the last 5-6 years, actually. So, yeah, they've ordained a number of priests just in the last 5-6 years. And so actually, some of these churches that they were functional, but there was no congregation, there were no people, there was no priest. They've actually been able to reopen the doors of some of these. So the little church in Kuzgunjuk that I mentioned, I was going there because they would do services on Wednesdays, but they didn't have a priest. But then they had these ordinations, and they assigned one of these new priests to the Kuzgunjuk church, and we started having church there on Sundays also. So, you know, there are these sort of actually, you know, it's an interesting time right now, and again, the Turkish Armenians will, So part of why it is an interesting time in Istanbul right now is because of the current government. And part of what my research actually centers on is the strange way that this basically Islamist party has actually done strange things that sometimes have helped Armenians. As weird as that sounds, and my politics we can leave to the side, but suffice it to say I'm not a huge supporter of the party, but they've done some interesting things. So for instance, one of the things that happened is that these guys wanted to be able to have, basically they wanted imams to be able to teach in schools. They wanted to sort of teach Islam in the public schools. But before, you had to be a certain kind of, you had to, you know, as with here, you have to sort of have a teaching degree to teach in schools. And so they changed the law because they wanted to have Muslim teachers, imams, teach in the schools. But because they still were sort of thinking about the European Union, they didn't make a law that said, now imams can teach in schools. Instead, they made a law that said, qualified religious instructors can teach in appropriate schools. So, what happened, for the first time, I suspect that when you went to school, at the Armenian schools, the priests didn't really teach in the school. They weren't teachers.
There was no religion in the schools. Yeah. It was taboo.
So there were, exactly. So there was no way for them to do so. In the past few years, I think now 3 of the priests have gotten certificates because they're educated men. They have degrees, many from other, from universities as well as from, say, Echmiadze. They've gotten the certificates, and they're now teaching classes, be it Armenian or actually some religion classes, in the Armenian schools. So this law that was really intended to help these guys did this strange thing that let Armenians have their priests teach in the Armenian schools for the first time. For the first time in the history of the Republic, in 100 years, this has been possible. So part of what my research is interested in is the fact that the laws that are made by people who are not interested in Armenians at all have on occasion done things unintendedly that have helped Armenians. So we live, actually, it's a very interesting time for Armenians in Istanbul and Armenians in Turkey because there are these sort of openings, these possibilities, and nobody's trying to help them. Don't get me wrong. Nobody is like actively excited about helping Armenians. But these things have happened. The other example, I don't have any pictures of, but the other example, there's a very famous Armenian hospital called Surpurgic. It's a very wealthy foundation. It's one of the best hospitals in all of Turkey, actually. It's an Armenian hospital. And they were building a new transit system. They were building a new train. And one of the train stops is right by the Armenian hospital. Now, I can tell you, nobody planned that. Nobody was like, you know what? We need to make it easier to get to Surpurgic. But, guess what? It's a lot easier to get to Surpurgic. And as somebody, I would go every Mondays. There's a little beautiful chapel, and they do Badanak on Mondays. And I would go every Monday. And there's a free shuttle, but it leaves very early in the morning. And if I missed the shuttle, it would take me forever to get there. And often I would just stay home because it was too hard. But now, it's very easy to get there. So again, nobody was planning this. Nobody was like, we need to put this stop near the Armenian hospital. But the expansion of the transit system has actually ended up helping Armenians in a strange way. So it's an interesting time for Armenians in Turkey. So I have here another picture. This is Excerpt. This is, again, the Vicar General / acting patriarch. The question of elections is very controversial right now. So I will leave that at that. We can have that in questions if we want to talk about some of this. And so, again, my expertise really is in Turkey, but I had the chance to take the trip to Jerusalem, to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so here is Nurhan Patriarch, who is the recent one, recently, well, it's been a couple years now, recently won the election and is now the Patriarch of Jerusalem. And, you know, part of why I like to put the Patriarchates of Istanbul and Jerusalem together is because of the sort of weird things that they are both experiencing. So one of the issues in Istanbul has been property. So all of the churches, well, I didn't really explain this, but there's a lot of property problems, some of which have been returned, but there's a sort of way in which the material basis of the community has been taken by the government. The same thing happens in Israel. So recently, parts of the Armenian quarter have been turned into parking lots. So in both cases, we have a historic old Armenian community where the state sort of is not actually, in terms of property, would rather have those properties. So this is one thing that I think is shared between the two patriarchates. The other one is actually the question of who gets to be patriarch and the sort of the appointment of the patriarch. In both Istanbul and in Jerusalem, there's a real problem, and the state gets a big say in this. So actually, we were talking earlier about Tiran Nersoyan, Archbishop Tiran Nersoyan of blessed memory, who we got lucky because he was actually elected the Patriarch of Jerusalem. And he waited because the state of Israel has to approve who will be the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem. And they didn't approve him. They didn't like him. They thought he was too political, too radical. So he ended up coming back to America. And like I said, I think maybe we won in the end because St. Narcissus was his brainchild that he developed after he was elected patriarch but could not go. So maybe we could thank Israel because we have St. Narcissus, because Israel didn't let Tiran Nersoyan back into Israel. But the same thing is true in Turkey to a degree. So in addition to picking the Patriarch of Istanbul, and to be the Patriarch, there are sort of very strict rules that come from the state. So the state actually is the one that says, to be the Patriarch of Istanbul, you have to have been born in Turkey, which is different than being a citizen, right? I could say, I'm going to move to Istanbul, I really like Turkey, I'm going to get myself a Turkish passport, now I'm a citizen of Turkey. Even if I become a bishop, I still will not be eligible to be the Patriarch. I have to have been born there. So there's actually only 5 eligible people on the planet who are eligible to be Patriarch of Istanbul. So Excerpt is one of them, actually. So this is another thing that is shared between, I have a picture of St. Narcissus because of the story of Tiran Nersoyan. Old St. Narcissus, actually. So, you know, these are two things, and I think I'll slow down here and kind of end and open to questions. But these two things, I think, that are really shared between Istanbul and Jerusalem are, one, the sort of the way in which the state has a really big say in who gets to do things, who is the patriarch, who, you know, the patriarchal elections. I mean, this seems ridiculous that they should be able to have such a say in it, but both in Israel and in Turkey, the state has a big say in who becomes the patriarch. This is one thing that is shared between them. The other thing that is shared between them is this question of property. So this is a building on the grounds inside the patriarchal walls in Jerusalem that is, you know, I mean, the point is that it's sort of not really used, that there's sort of problems with the buildings. I mean, it's just a picture of a building. But the point is that property in both places is a really big issue. The state tries to take some, you know, etc. And so actually this has been a problem in Jerusalem and Israel for a long time. This is a picture of me of, these are the chains worn by the so-called Krikor Sheklian here, the chain bearer, who was a 18th century patriarch of Jerusalem, who at the time Jerusalem, they had a lot of debts. And so the patriarch wore these chains, and he wandered all around the Ottoman Empire collecting money from Armenians, and he refused to take the chains off until he paid back all the debts of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. So, again, the point of this story, in my case, other than the fact that it's a really sort of lovely story and shows dedicated hierarchs, is that property is really a problem for both of these communities. So I think I'm more or less, let's see, this is me in Jerusalem, this is with Dink, this is with Malachi or Armenian. But the point is that also in both of these places, we still do have a sort of vibrant community in both Jerusalem and in Istanbul. But they've got a lot of problems, and they've got a lot of problems that they share. So I like to think about them together because they highlight what those problems are. And I just want to sort of end, and then we can keep talking. We have questions.